Welcome to this compilation of the most important shading and rendering tips for Blender 2.8. It'll be especially helpful if you're moving from 2.7, but even if you're new, you'll learn some tricks. You can find the full course for free in the link below. Hope you enjoy. There are three different render engines that ship with Blender 2.8. There's Eevee, which is on by default, Workbench, and Cycles. Cycles you're likely already familiar with from Blender 2.79, and Eevee is the new real-time render engine that I'm sure you've heard a lot about already, and it's the real-time approximation of Cycles that still uses the same nodes and whatnot, so it should be pretty easy to get into. The last one is Workbench, and I want to talk about that one for a second because it's what powers the 3D viewport. When you're in solid shaded view or wireframe view, you're using Workbench under the hood. So even if you've set your render engine to be Cycles, which, by the way, you can only set in the render properties here in the properties editor and not the main header. But as it's not something you switch between in the middle of a project very often, it makes sense. But even if you set your render engine to Cycles and we're in solid shaded view, it's important to know that this is using Workbench. Now there are a lot of settings in the drop-down arrow here in the viewport shading popover, and these are per viewport. So if we have a second viewport here, let's say we set this one to use flat shading and we turn off shadow and cavity and use a single color. And this is really handy because we can have one viewport look at the silhouette while the other viewport looks at the fully textured object, and it could be very helpful to have both at the same time. Now this comes into play if we switch our render engine over to Workbench and we hit F12, and of course we need a camera, so let's add that. Okay, so now we hit F12 to render, or we could just go to render and render image, and we get a result that's neither viewport. And that's because while it's using the same render engine as the viewport, it's not using the viewport settings. By the way, to render, there are no large render image and render animation buttons here in the properties editor, so you will have to use the render menu or the hotkeys. But as I was saying, there's a separate set of lighting and color and other options here for the actual render itself. And to see those in play, we can switch over to the render preview. And this is going to be consistent between all viewports. Here you can see exactly what the render will look like if you set it to any of these different lighting or color options. You also get a few other options that you're not going to see reflected in the viewport, such as the render samples, the amount of anti-aliasing samples, as well as film transparency. So if we turn this on, you can see that if we go to render our image, the background is now transparent. This is really important to note because you still have access to the Workbench engine even if you're using Cycles or Eevee. So let's say, for example, we switch over to Cycles. We have all of the settings here, but we don't have the Workbench settings anymore. But when we switch to solid view or wireframe view, we're still using the Workbench engine. So if we go to view and viewport render image, we're going to be using the Workbench settings. So this can be a little bit confusing because we can't actually find those settings anywhere in the interface at the moment. Because if we wanted to make this background not transparent any longer, we really can't do that, except if we go to the Workbench settings and turn off transparent film and then switch back to Cycles. So that is a little bit confusing at first, but at least it's all in one place. The same goes for Eevee as well. Say we're using Cycles and we have our look dev preview here. We can render this out with view and viewport render image. We don't even need a camera for this, which is really nice. But let's say we want to turn off ambient occlusion. It's not available in the look dev viewport shading popover. We'd actually need to go into the Eevee settings to turn it off. So we need to go to the render properties, render engine, switch to Eevee, turn off ambient occlusion. Let's turn off screen space reflections. And then we need to switch back to Cycles in order to render this out as we intended. So the render engine settings here do actually affect the viewport renders. One last thing with viewport rendering is that it doesn't actually work with Cycles. Hopefully this will be fixed in the future, but if you go to a render preview with Cycles and go to viewport render image, it's just completely blank. So hopefully that clears up any confusion between the three different render engines. I find it helpful to have them all here at the same time, just because I typically render out a final render with Cycles, but it's really nice to be able to use Eevee for that look dev preview and just like a good material preview so that I can quickly tweak things as well. It's also really nice to have this Workbench render engine so I can render out a play blast with viewport render animation. You just, again, need to be aware that in order to change the settings, for example, to make a transparent background, you're going to have to switch to the Workbench render engine, change those settings, and then change it back. There's no clear distinction here between what changes things in the viewport versus what changes things in the viewport render, so hopefully that's something that gets cleared up in the future. Wireframe View in Blender 2.79 was exactly that. It's kind of a big blob of wires, and it's very handy for being able to see and select through your object, but there's not a whole lot you can do with it. So it totally worked, but in Blender 2.8 we have a better solution. Now, one thing to note is that the colors of the wireframes did change in 2.79 based on a couple different things. For example, groups. So if you have a new object here, well, of course, selection changed the color. But also if you hit Control-G and assign something to a new group, it would appear as green. So that's just something to note, as the colors did actually do something in there. And the color of the wireframe was defined by the theme. So in Blender 2.8, we now have a few more options for wireframe that makes them much more flexible, and they're just overall improved in general. So first of all, if we switch to Wireframe View, either by switching over here in this top right toggle, or by hitting Z and switching over to Wireframe on the pie menu, then you'll notice a few things. First, we definitely have wires like before, but they're a little bit easier to see, or it's easier to see the form of our object, because the parts of the object that are occluded are now a lighter color than the ones directly in front of the camera. So the ones directly in front of us are drawn as very, very dark and solid. The ones behind are drawn as more of a dashed line. And so this helps us see a little bit more clearly what exactly is going on. And it's a good in-between between the hidden wire and the completely solid black mass. Now there's also a little bit of a Fresnel effect, which is kind of cool and kind of hard to see on this low poly example. But if we take a Suzanne here and just give it a lot of subsurf with Control-3 and unselect it there, we can actually still see what Suzanne looks like, even though everything's just a completely black mass there. So we can still see the form of it based on that Fresnel. In 2.79, we could not. So if we go ahead and add a Suzanne, scale it down, give it lots of subsurf, there's no way we're seeing anything in there at all. So that's a really nice touch and makes it a little bit easier to work with, even when selected and whatnot. So there are just general improvements to wireframes overall, but we also have a few more options for flexibility. So if we go to the shading options here when in Wireframe View, we can change the color from single to object, which again uses the object properties viewport display color. And there's also random, which is pretty sweet. So that's pretty nice and allows you to differentiate between objects very easily. Now what's cool is that these settings are specific to the shading mode. So even though I have the color set to random, when I switch over to solid shaded view, we're now back in single shaded view, or if we switch to texture, we're going to be in texture shaded view. But then once we switch to wireframe, it'll jump back to random because it saves these settings per our viewport shading option, which is really, really nice. Now we have the same background color options as before. We also have the same outline options as before, but we also have a slider for the X-ray, similar to the solid shaded view X-ray. It just changes the opacity of the occluded wireframe. So if we turn this all the way up and essentially just toggle X-ray off, then we're not going to see what's behind this. And this is the hidden wire effect that we had in 2.79. And if we turn this on and turn this down, then we're going to get wireframes a little bit more similar to what we had in 2.79, where there's no occlusion whatsoever. So a 0.5 default is pretty good, helps us to see things clearly, and just works well overall. But one thing to note is that if you have things in a group or other things in 2.79 that were colored and that were indicated by the color in the wireframe view, if we go ahead and group these things, let's just select one and go to Object, Collections, Add to Collection. It's not going to change the color here based on that. So that is one thing to note, but honestly, I like it that way a little bit better. Now I hear that coloring objects based on which collection they're in will be coming in the future, so look out for that in later versions of Blender, but for now, the only options are single, object, and random. There is a material shading option in Blender 2.79 down here in the 3D view header if you switch over to material, and it'll try to approximate what that material would look like in the 3D viewport. But in Blender 2.8, of course, with Eevee, things are a whole lot better. If we switch over to the material, or what's now called the Look Dev preview, we now get a much better approximation of what things would look like in cycles. Now in the viewport shading options, we have a few different settings. First, we can opt to use the scene lights. So if we add a light to the scene, let's just add a light and a sun lamp pointed that direction. You can see that it's not doing anything in this particular look dev scene, but if we go to our options and enable scene lights, you can see that that is now applied. So if we turn up the brightness quite a bit, you can see it's casting a shadow and doing all that it's supposed to do. But if we turn that off, then it won't affect the scene whatsoever. So that's kind of nice. And you can also set to use the scene world, which right now is just a flat color, instead of the look dev preview. But the preview is pretty nice. It's just a preset of a bunch of different HDRs, and you can install your own if you'd like. But this just gives you a pretty cool approximation of what things would look like when rendered, so you don't have to go and set up all your lighting just to edit your materials. Now, there are a few things missing from this viewport shading dropdown that you'll actually only find in the rendered settings when you're using the Eevee render engine. So even if you switch over to cycles, LookDev is always going to be using Eevee. But you won't find the settings, for example, ambient occlusion, in the cycles settings here. So you actually need to switch over to Eevee to turn on things like ambient occlusion, or for example, bloom, which right now you can't really see it, because it shouldn't be too obvious. But if for some reason you wanted like a ton of it, there we go. that's definitely some bloom. You wouldn't actually be able to set that if you were using cycles because it's just not in the preview drop down there. So you have to switch over to Eevee, and that'll be the same in your look dev as in the rendered view. But everything else, like the actual environment itself, will be different. But just be aware that if you need subsurface scattering, motion blur, screen space reflections, that's a especially important one. You can see that that really does change the look of things, especially on the legs here, where it's reflecting the floor. You know, that's pretty important to have in your look dev scene, even if you're just using cycles, but you have to go into the Eevee render engine to find it. Even though layers are no longer part of the 3D view header, they still exist in Blender 2.8. They're just found in the top right here next to the scene selection. So here I have two layers, or more specifically now they're called view layers, and I can switch between them. I've called the first one full scene, that just renders everything, and the second one is just car, where I'm only viewing the car. You can see that all of my other collections have been unchecked, so only the car is going to render. You can find the settings for the view layers in the View Layer tab in the Properties editor, and here's where you can set all of the different passes or rendering options for those layers. So you can use it for rendering. If you don't want it to render at all, you can just uncheck that. Or you can render single layer, which is going to render only the active view layer. If we switch over to our compositing workspace, you can see that I have two render outputs here, one for each layer. And as I add passes to this one, this is for the car, you can see it adds it to the compositor over here. And if I switch over here to the full scene and start adding passes, I can add, different passes for the different view layers, which is great for compositing. So it might take a little bit of getting used to, as you can't like flip between them with the 3D view header, but it is a little bit more concise and makes more sense, at least to me, once you get used to it. But just be aware that you do need to switch them up here in the top right. And so just as before, nothing here is really changing between these layers. The objects are still the exact same objects. It's just changing whether or not they're being viewed or being rendered, and outputting different passes for rendering based on what you've chosen here in the Properties editor. The outliner has quite a few new toggles, but they're not all on by default. The most obvious ones are the checkboxes next to collections, and you can simply turn those off to absolutely nuke those from the scene, so they're not being rendered, they're not being viewed, so it's a really easy way to just disable it all at once. But if you want more fine-tuned control, and especially on an object level instead of a collection level, then we can enable more of these toggles. We find them in the filter popover in the outliner here, and let's just turn on all of them and see what they do. First is the selection, and that was in 2.79, and it works exactly the same. If we uncheck the selection for the monkeys, then we're not going to be able to select them in 3D view, and we'll just select right through them to the plane underneath. You'll see that all of the selection icons for the objects in the collection have been grayed out, meaning that we can't select them anyway. We also have the eye icon, which as you might expect, just hides it from the scene. However, this might get a little confusing if you try the next checkbox and it looks like it's doing the exact same thing. However, there is an important distinction. The eye icon is tied to the scene level, while this monitor icon, which is representing enable or disable in viewport, is tied to the object itself. So if we disable this in the viewport, then it's not going to show up when we link it to another file. Now the render icon does the same as in 2.8, it just excludes it from the render. Next to that we have a new one, which is the holdout, and this helps collections replace groups in the render layers. So no longer do we have render layers in 2.8, we have view layers, and selecting this will make sure that this collection, the monkeys collection, will not be rendered in the no monkeys view layer. So we have a couple different view layers here. I've got one for full scene, one for monkeys only, and one for no monkeys. So to make sure that the monkeys are not being rendered, we have a few different options. We could just not render them at all, but if we were to go ahead and do that, I'll just set render single layer now so it doesn't render all of the view layers. But you can see that, okay, now it's just kind of excluded them completely. Right? It's as if they just don't exist at all. But that's not always what we want. Sometimes we might want them to look like they exist, but we want it to actually mask out and be transparent in that area. For that, we'd use a holdout. So let's go ahead and render that again. And now you can see that where the monkeys are completely transparent. And let's go over to our compositing again and look at that. So you can see that those monkeys have just been cut out, but they still cast shadows, the bounce lighting still works, they still exist, it's just that those areas are completely cut. There's another option next to the holdout, let's enable it here in the compositing workspace, and that is indirect only. You can see that it's grayed out if we have the holdout already enabled, and that's because it's already being rendered as transparent, so there's no reason to have these both on at once. But if we turn off holdout and turn on indirect only, and we go ahead and render that, and you can see that it's as if they still exist, they're still casting shadows and all of that stuff, and you can see the ground below them, but the object itself is completely transparent. So that's also another handy option, and of course these are specific to the view layers themselves. And let's say for the monkeys only layer, let's switch over to that, then we'll take the ground and just either uncheck it or unrender it or use indirect only or something like that. I think the mask option works really well here instead of just unchecking it completely, because you can see that nothing's bouncing off of the ground and onto the monkeys, and it looks like it's kind of floating. But if we go ahead and render this again, let's uncheck render single layer so it renders all of them. Now on the monkeys only layer, the ground is actually contributing to the result, it's just showing up as transparent. And similarly here with the no monkeys, because of that indirect only, they're not showing up themselves, but they're still contributing to the result behind them, and we can easily combine one on top of the other. Because left click in the node editor now does box selection, you can't really shift and left click and drag over things anymore to reroute them, which was very handy. So the keyboard shortcuts are a little bit different here for managing nodes. The two most important things are cutting the links and adding reroutes. Now cutting links you can do over here in the cut tool here, and you can just slice between some links and destroy them. You can also do that just by holding Control and right click and dragging over some links, and that will cut them. But then to reroute them you need to hold Shift and then right click and drag. So it's similar to what it was before, but if you don't know that it's changed it already, it can be kind of frustrating to try to figure out. So just remember that you need to hold Control and right click instead to use the knife, and then Shift and right click to join them together. One quirk of Eevee in Blender 2.8 is that instance lights don't cast shadows. So you can duplicate objects and all that stuff just fine. If you take your objects and Shift D, that works, and you can even Alt D to create an instance duplicate where the data is shared between these different objects, but this isn't a collection instance, it's just a object instance where you can see that the light is sharing the same light data. However, if you create a collection instance, in my case I was making a bunch of street lights and trying to easily array them with a collection instance, but if you do that, you can see it does not cast a shadow. So just be aware that when you're doing this, whether you're linking it to another file or creating collection instances within one scene, and collection instances are super helpful because you can just move around your different objects and make changes to one and it'll affect all of them, and they're very, very quick to use. Unfortunately though, they don't cast shadows. This is a known limitation, but it's not a quick fix. I reported it to the developers, but it may take some time before that gets patched. So in the meantime, just be aware that you need to actually duplicate this or use Alt-D instead of collection instances for things that need to cast shadows.
So here's a few tips on how to get some transparent objects inside the viewport in Blender 2.80. So here we have solid mode going on, which is actually the workbench engine. This is just how it looks inside our viewport. And up here, you see this is the solid mode enabled. We've got our lighting and colors down here. So we want to look at the colors, and this is going to tell us how do you want to shade these objects inside our viewport. So if we wanted to do transparency, we've got two options here. We can choose material or we can choose object. So first of all, I'll show you material. So what it's going to do, it's going to use the material settings. So inside our object here, let's jump down to the materials. We've got our glass, and we want to change the way that the glass is displayed inside our viewport. So this is our viewport display, and we choose our color here, and we can change the alpha value to be whatever we want inside our viewport. So let's just leave it as is for now. Now, if we wanted to do the whole object, let's just change our mode over to object, and then we go over to the object buttons, and let's look for our viewport display. This is our viewport display here, and this is the color that the whole object is going to display as, and we can zoom it down here, and then we can get a kind of cool transparent X-ray type material. All right, here's a rendering issue with the Eevee render engine. We're just looking at solid mode now of a propeller, but if I jump over to look dev mode in Eevee, of course, you'll see that it's not rendering correctly, and this is actually how it shows up in the final render as well. So how do we fix this? It's really simple. We just go over to our material, so make sure that we're choosing the right material. This happens to be propeller wood, and then we turn off under our material settings, under the settings, show backface, and now we cannot see the inside, and it's going to render it correctly. So here's a simple animated clouds texture inside the Eevee render engine, and I actually want to be able to see through the black part, so there's actually not showing the transparency here. So how do we fix that? Well, actually over in our material settings, so you can see this is actually our material here. It's just an animated noise texture to create the clouds. But over here in the material setting, we've got the blend mode. It's set to opaque. Now this is a default setting. If we change our alpha to alpha blend, you'll see, now we can actually see through that. And we can also have similar settings with the shadow. So we probably want to choose alpha clip. So we don't get a square shadow, we'll actually get these clouds making shadows, and we can see through. But you'll notice I can actually see on both sides, but if we have backface culling turned on, I can only see it from the one side. So that's what this setting does as well. Oh no, what's wrong with my glass material? Okay, so I'm inside Eevee here, and we can't see through this guy's eyes. What is going on? We're in look dev mode, obviously, and we want to be able to see what's behind this glass. So over here in the settings, in our scene settings, we want to make sure that we have screen space reflections turned on, and that's going to give us some nice reflections on all the materials. And we also want to make sure we have refraction on, because this glass material is a refraction object. So now we can see his beautiful eyeballs. Are your hair particles looking like hairy caterpillars stuck on someone's face? Make sure that you've got your Eevee settings correct. So jump over into the Eevee settings down here under hair, and make sure that we haven't got strand selected, but we have strip selected. That's much better.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. Check the link below for the full course of over 50 lessons, all of which are completely free. See you there.